Right, I think we could begin now. A warm welcome to everyone for our first webinar of the Scottish Arctic Network. And we're very grateful to Dr. Paul Adams from Strathclyde University, who agreed to be our first experiment in this. And I can see already that some very high-tech solutions are happening on Teams. I should use that sometime soon. So Paul is a senior lecturer at the University of Strathclyde, and he has also been doing some leading research on Northern Pedagogies with funding secured from both the Arctic Connections Fund, but also from the Royal Society of Edinburgh to do a project on some collaboration between higher education institutions in Scotland and within the Arctic. And we're really excited to hear more about Paul's research. So there will be a presentation first, and then there will be opportunity to have a discussion and ask some questions. My name is Daria. I'm the chair of the Scottish Arctic Network, and we have Jill here who helps with organization, and big thank you to her for making all of this happen administratively. And thank to all of you for joining us this afternoon. So without further ado, I will pass the torch to Paul for his presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Daria. Just to say, I'm not very good on Teams, so I'm not used it very often, and I've just pressed a button, and I'm not sure what's happened when I pressed it. So I don't know what you can see, but I hope you can all see my slides. I'm not sure what's going on. I can't see myself, which is also a bit unnerving at times. So what I'll talk for about 25-30 minutes just about a project that we won funding for from the Scottish Government Arctic Connections Fund, and which we are now moving on with using funding from the Royal Society of Edinburgh. What I'll talk to you today about is the initial project that we did, which funded a 3-day event for initial teacher educators from higher education institutions across Scotland to get together for 3 days to start to talk about and think about how differing perspectives on pedagogy might enable us to reconceptualize and maybe even rupture some notions of initial teacher education in Scotland. So just do some, what is it they say, shout outs, I suppose that's the word, for some of my colleagues. There are many people that have been involved in this work, and I've listed a few people there, the few people that have been, I suppose, more directly involved with things. But we have to say thank you to all of the people from the HEIs around Scotland, and indeed people from other universities around the northern region in particular, that have lent us their expertise, their insight, and their thoughts as well. So we have quite a few of these people here today, and we have a few apologies. We also have I noticed a colleague of mine from the University of Calgary, Dr. Amy Burns, going above and beyond, because I think it's probably daft o'clock where Amy is, but Amy's part of a project now that's extending to bring in Canada and Greenland to this particular work as well. So those are the people that have been mainly involved in this first part of the project, but there are many people getting involved in the future. So briefly, what I'll talk to you about then is a brief overview of what we might mean by Arctic pedagogy. I'll talk to you a bit about the Scottish Government bid and work associated with that, and then I'll talk to you about some of the outcomes that have come out of that, those first 3 days that we did in January of this year. So if we start thinking about Arctic pedagogy, then I mean, as with all ideas about pedagogy, it's quite a contested area, but looking at the literature, and in particular the work of Marta and Uisia Uti, talking about Arctic pedagogy as being that interface between Arctic information and Arctic skills, where we think about learning processes, environments, teacherhood, educational leadership, and multi-professionalism. And that's been taken on by the UArctic Thematic Network on Teacher Education for Social Justice and Diversity in Education, which talks about community, culture, language, elders, and digitization as well as features of an Arctic pedagogy approach. So when we're talking about Arctic pedagogy, obviously what we're talking about is something to do with education, teaching, learning, teachers, learners, young people, adults, etc., within the circumpolar north. But what we were looking at with
I'm sorry, Paul, I think you got muted for the past 10 seconds.
Is that me again?
Yeah, that's good.
Yeah, brilliant, lovely. Okay, so what we wanted to think about was how these ideas about Arctic pedagogy, broadly speaking, might help us to begin to challenge some contemporary notions of initial teacher education across Scotland, and in particular, think about how the principles of Arctic pedagogy, how we might take those and begin to examine initial teacher education, and pedagogy, broadly speaking, and how these connect across people, place, and time, and how these might add to our understanding of the ITE process. So many of you may well be aware of the Scottish Government Arctic Connections Fund, but what we did when we applied for the funding, and a number of us wrote this bid, was we wanted to challenge the kind of Anglophonic notions of pedagogy, which really situates pedagogy as simplistically the methods and practices of teaching, which can be challenged or accepted depending on your point of view. But what we were thinking about was the idea that actually English language in research and scholarship on pedagogy in particular is very dominant, and how many other areas of work, particularly knowledge from perhaps a Germanic or Nordic tradition, or indeed perspectives from an indigenous perspective, can actually pose challenges to that simplicity, and can actually allow us to elevate other forms of knowing that actually challenge this sort of Western scientific canon, and challenge these notions of how we teach, how we learn, how we construct education, etc., that are very much located in a numerification of learning. We teach, children and young people learn, this is the outcome because they get scores on the doors with their education, as it were. And there are many of us working in this area, but we wanted to see whether there were other ways of knowing, other ways of thinking that could begin to challenge that, and begin to challenge this idea that teachers are all knowing and have all of the answers. I mean, certainly teachers need to know things and need to be able to convey that knowledge, but to situate any of us as all knowing is deeply problematic, we think. And also to challenge this idea that pupils are vessels to be filled. Pupils, children, young people come to educational situations, pedagogic situations, with a whole wealth of pre-existing knowledge, pre-existing skills, ways of being, ways of understanding. And all too often in the Anglophonic context, in the Western context, they're either lost at worst, or what often happens simply is that they are positioned as existing outside of the classroom, and things that we sort of leave at the classroom door and we don't bring with us. And we wanted to begin to think about how we might challenge those assumptions, and how we might begin to gift, if you like, our student teachers and our teachers working in classrooms, and indeed anybody else working in education, with alternative ways of thinking about the educational project and thinking about pedagogic identity and pedagogic perspectives. So what we, sorry, yeah, for some reason I'm muting every time I click on, but I think I've solved that problem now. Sorry. So what we said in the bid was that Arctic pedagogy derives from this intricate and these intimate relationships between people, place, and time, and in a sense, then geospatial political awareness. We wanted to understand how pedagogy within the Arctic context cannot be divorced from geology, from geography, from space, from time, from politics, etc. And we wanted to think about how that might help us promote educational interventions more concerned with sharing agreed knowledge, and agreed knowledge from a variety of perspectives that are embedded within ways of being, that are intimately connected with and to lessons from the past, how we live in the present, but supportive of a sustainable future. What we were concerned with was to, in a sense, move away from a very simple chronological view of pedagogy education and have a much more phenomenological understanding of that, with the idea that although we live in the present, that present is intimately connected with our past and the past of others, and our future and the future of others. And this wasn't a call to some sort of romantic other, but a way of trying to divert education towards enduring ways of living. And what we proposed at the beginning, and this comes out of something I wrote in 2022, is that pedagogy reconceptualizing as away from just simple methods and practices of teaching towards actually understanding how we are being in and how we act on the world with and for others, a much more existential approach, a much more phenomenological approach, which is connected to a multitude of ways of understanding our position on the planet, with others, etc. That moves us away from simple notions of methods and practices, as I say. And the project itself had these particular objectives, which we were saying, which we held that we would achieve through these 4 particular events. The first 2 were held. That was a 3-day event in January. And the last one happened at that event. We increased awareness amongst ITE staff, certainly, of the North to North exchange programme. We are at the moment.
Paul, you did it again.
Sorry, I don't know what's happening there. So the third point, publishing research and findings in education in the North, we have papers in now, and Professor Gris-Polgard and myself are editing a special edition on that, which will be coming out at the end of this year, fingers crossed. And I think we have about 12 or 14 submissions for that, which stem not only from this project, but from other people writing about their views of pedagogy from a northern perspective. And we might perhaps come back to what we mean by northern in the future. Okay, so a brief overview then of what we did on the 2 days. So briefly, the inputs on the first day. The first was from Professor Gris, which was and Gris was challenging our hitherto notions of metrocentricity as the basis for pedagogic interventions. This idea that, you know, we live in a post-industrial turn, which means that we are located mainly in urban contexts, and actually non-urban contexts, which are euphemistically often called rural or remote. And I suppose whether they're remote or not depends on from what perspective you're looking at. But these are often othered. And Gris was helping us challenge this idea about deficit thinking of rural and remote areas, and actually challenging us to think more clearly about how the post-industrial turn has led to us imagining education in a particular way. But also what Gris talked about really usefully was this challenge to a sort of neo-Piagetian ideology of age and stage for learning, as it were. And getting and what we began to do was get embroiled in some political messaging. And we all know about this from the pandemic era. You know, learning's lost. We need to catch up. And we were challenging those notions, and Gris was challenging us on those days when we're thinking about what's been lost. Well, what has been lost? And actually what's been lost is often this connection with the post-industrial turn, this connection with the othering of rural and remote, this connection of this idea of deficit thinking. These young people, you know, are missing elements of the curriculum that are vitally important. So says who? And challenging this idea of hegemonic middle classing and neoliberal centering, you know, this ubiquity of the economic as the definer for sustainability. The idea, unless we sort out our economics, we can't possibly have anything that is sustainable in the future. And then Kalpana from the Faroe Islands, who's here today as well, talked to us about her perspectives from being an incomer, if you like, into the Faroe Islands, although Kalpana's lived there for over 25 years now, and talking about the relationship of being an incomer, being an immigrant in that context, and the way in which she was very aware of intercultural consciousness and the curiosity and understanding of others for others, but warned about the practices of othering others and how that often fosters silence, which is a real problem. And how can we begin to challenge the idea of othering others who are in rural or remote contexts, pejoratively speaking perhaps, and how that othering often silences those people and silences the things that they bring to the table and the things that they have to offer, which can actually rupture and challenge some of the more metrocentric ways of being and ways of knowing. And then Hermina from Iceland, highlighting the work that she's been doing in rural, remote and island regions in Iceland and around Iceland, thinking about the redesign of the school curriculum and how a flexible school curriculum can begin to allow us to adopt ways of knowing, ways of being, ways of understanding ourselves, children, young people, contexts, people, place and time, etc., in ways that are much more open and much more flexible for moves towards the future. And that resonates quite strongly with us, given that we do have curriculum for excellence in schools, which is a very flexible way of understanding curriculum, as it were. And then Tuija from Finland finished off talking about, well, actually what we need to challenge is this idea of the centre. You know, where is the centre and for whom is the centre and with whom is the centre, and led us on to considering some of the position statements for Arctic pedagogy, which abound at the particular moment in time. Now, the 3 days were held and we had lots and lots of activities that were undertaken, and I don't really have time to go through those with you, but if you go to the UArctic webpage, you'll be able to see all of the keynotes and all of the other presentations that were made on the 3 days, and you can get a flavour of what we actually talked about and what we thought about. But some of the takeaways from this, and these are just 4 quotes that I selected from the feedback that we got, and the way that this began to help people, in some cases, re-engage with things that they'd perhaps learnt about, thought about in the past, and perhaps had slipped down the list of things to do, as it were, but also things that actually made them rethink anew about what they might want to understand and want to do, particularly with teacher education and initial teacher education. So we've got the top one there, which is the, re-engaging with the importance of language, and the question, are we even aware how much power language has in our everyday lives? And the way that, just using the words rural and remote is particularly connotative of and constructive of a particular way of looking and thinking about people and their environment, etc. And somebody else saying the importance of holding on to all the voices and experiences which lie beneath policy narratives. And somebody else saying, I think that a society where the measure of success is profit is always going to struggle with working to maintain local communities, as this idea of scale and uniformity have such a tight grip. And here this person was making connections with Tuija's provocation, and saying that they've already seen themselves beginning to push back on some of these norms, beginning to push back on these assumptions that abound when we use particular language forms or particular terms or particular assumptions. And then finally, somebody else is saying that actually this is giving them the agency to begin to reconceptualize and study places and how these are always mediated, how our local places are always mediated, and how we understand that local place is not necessarily the way that other people understand those local places and local terms, and that for some people the centre being this sort of rural or remote area, as it were, this centre is actually vitally important for some people. Although it may appear secondary in a metrocentric view, that secondary assumptions are deeply problematic, because what they do is distance people in other regions, other areas, and with other ways of knowing, other ways of being and belonging, and that makes it deeply problematic, which leads to a disconnect perhaps with education through pedagogic forms, etc. And the further outcome that we've got on this is that we've been successful with a collaborative bid to extend our work to Canada and Greenland in particular. So as we're extending to Greenland, we will be extending further with Denmark as well, obviously. And this is we have a kick-off meeting in Tromsø in January 2024, where we are a larger group, lots of people from the Tromsø region and lots of people from other areas across, loosely termed, the north, as it were, are meeting to begin to think about how we might develop this work across the region, but also bring in indigenous ways of knowing. So bring in work from Sami communities, Inuit communities, bringing work from ways of knowing from North American communities as well, from Métis communities, but also how we might, I guess, begin to Scotify that, to use a particular phrase. So how we might use perhaps terms such as restanza, which is a term from Tutti in Italy, and an ethnographer there, but also some other terms, hiraeth, which is a Welsh term, Sianlas, a Gaelic term, which talk about an idea to return to one's home, one's particular area, but not in a sense of simplistic historical ways of knowing, but returning in a means to challenge and in a means to develop those particular areas. And what we're also doing as well is working with other groups that are connecting with, sorry, something's just come over, my dogs are now barking, sorry, hang on a moment. Sorry about that. How we connect with groups working across rural and remote education locations. And just to finish off, one thing we are very, very conscious of, and we were conscious of very much at the beginning, is not this idea of us from the West trying to find out about other ways of knowing and then saying, well, that can simply enrich what we do, but actually studying and working with other communities for understanding how that can rupture what we're doing and how that can begin to transform our ways of understanding. And this is a really nice quote that we put in the original bid to the Scottish Government from Rasmussen, talking about this kind of, in a sense, this middle classing idea of sitting under the banyan tree or sitting in the igloo or whatever and saying, oh, here we are, we are part of this world now, and what we can do is we can return to our locations and we can talk about the suffering of people across the world, and we can begin to be more aware of that. We wanted to challenge that particular deficit notion, and what we want to do is begin to understand the way that the privileging of us in the West has actually meant that 20% of the world's resources are now spread very thinly across regions and across communities. And actually, what that means is that we are, in normally speaking, the West are operating from a particular model which is very much divorced from sustainable ways of knowing, ecological ways of knowing, but very divorced from ways of understanding and living with the world and in the world, as it were, and how we can begin to challenge forms of pedagogy which exist at the moment quite simply. And how we can bring and reconnect with ways of knowing that are worldly, more broadly speaking. So that's really what I wanted to say today. I'm not sure how I stop sharing now, Daria, because I've not done this before on Teams.
It's the top right corner. The red button, leave, don't press that, but there's right next to it, there's a share button. It should have a cross on it for you.
Have I done that now?
Yeah, I think you have done it now. Perfect.
Brilliant. Thank you. Okay, well, thank you very much, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Paul. I've learned a lot. I think one of the interesting things about inviting people from all the different disciplines is that you do get insights into other ways of doing research and understanding things. And I've noted down a lot of terms that I will need to Google and explore after the talk. And I would like to open up the floor for any questions or comments or challenges or compliments. You should be able to raise your hand up at the top bar, or if you prefer, you can type your message into the chat instead. So we have a hand from John.
Yeah.
Hey, John.
Thanks, Paul, for a very interesting presentation on this issue. And hello, Gry. I know collaborating on this in the Nordic region. I found it very interesting from a Danish perspective, because in the Danish perspective, we have this issue of othering and this issue of the periphery, with the centrism, you could say, in the relation between metropolitan Denmark and the areas of the, how would you call that, the community, the national community of the Faroe Islands and Greenland. And actually, I'm supervising a wonderful PhD student, Greta Jimenez, for the time being, who's defending very soon her thesis. And she's trying to look upon this issue from a post-colonial perspective, which has been quite a huge work, because how do you rethink post-colonial from the American or the global South context to a Nordic context, which is usually not thought upon as being a post-colonial context, but which has many of the aspects. And then she goes into work what an Arctic pedagogy maybe could look like. So I think you should actually contact her.
That'd be good.
Like she's trying to do post-colonial struggle against dominant concepts of policy, like well-being, like evidence, like efficiency and quality, and trying to expand what these terms can meet in order to make them struggle or fighting concepts to be used. So she's trying to redefine what does the term of well-being mean in a Faroese context, which does not have very much written material on pedagogy, and therefore it's a very seminal work, I think.
Excellent.
And the other thing, of course, is how do you deal with this issue of the relation between the periphery and the center without romanticizing Christianity, without romanticizing nature, without romanticizing what you could call familial piety or love and things like that. And she's been working a lot with these traps. And I wonder how you deal with getting into those kinds of traps.
I think the first thing we do is invite your PhD student to join us, because she's obviously doing work that we need to do. And no, they're really good questions, John. I think at the end of the day, you know, we have a similar situation in Scotland to you. I mean, in the rural areas in Scotland, I mean, not so much in the borders, because there's that connection with England, but certainly in the northern areas and certainly in the islands, there's that othering. You know, I mean, speaking with my colleagues who work on the islands or work in the you know, right up in the Highlands, I mean, they will say that often what we get is this romanticism, you know. So people move into the islands because, oh, it's a wonderful place to live, and and there's that kind of romantic view, and then the you know, the winds come across in the winter, and the rain comes and everything. They start thinking, oh, I'm not so sure I like this anymore, you know. And we always get that. There's always that kind of, I suppose I call that middle classing in a way. You know, I've sold my house in London or Edinburgh, and now I'm going to move somewhere, and oh, look, I can buy a house really cheaply, and I can live in this beautiful part of the world, and yeah, it's great. But then what happens is the other of the rural or the other of the remote becomes very much part and parcel of their life, and that becomes central to them, and they realise that it's central, but they don't like that central. They don't like being in that central. And that then becomes a tension, and you get things like saying, oh, you know, there's not enough pavements here, or not enough street lights, and it becomes that kind of work, which then I think taps into your idea about efficiency and about your idea about, you know, the kind of modern world, as it were, that unless these things connect with the way that we think in the cities or the way that we think in these particular metropolitan areas, then, well, obviously that's a deficit. Obviously that's a problem. And we're trying to break those down. And actually, on the first 3 days, there were a lot of people. In fact, I think everybody who left from the HEI said, actually, this has made me realise that I work in the Central Belt, and actually, I kind of take for granted all this stuff. And then I do have this kind of romantic view about what goes on elsewhere. And actually, in some cases, it can be quite romantic. Wow, look at that view. Wow, look at this. But at the other hand, it's not. There's an element of living and being in these particular contexts. And certainly what we want to do is challenge these anglophonic terms, efficiency, standards, and all these sorts of things, which, I mean, my personal view is these are particularly meaningless. If you strip out the economic, they become meaningless, to be absolutely honest with you. So we want to challenge that. I don't know how we do it, given where we are, and given the ways in which the economy comes to the fore, and all these sorts of things. So I don't know that we have any answers at the moment, which I guess is why we ended up with the RSE bid, because we've got more questions to ask. But certainly I shall be in contact with your PhD student, and I think they probably need to join us as well on our journey, which would be really good. That would be excellent. Yeah, that would be excellent. So thanks, John. We'll talk about it tomorrow when we meet, have a coffee.
Thank you very much for the question, John, and thank you, Paul, for an answer. Gri, I see your hand. I think there's just a couple of comments in the chat, so I'm just going to read them out because they're not questions, they're rather comments, and then I'm going to pass the floor to you. So we have a comment from Roxanne who says, thanks very much, and there's a lot to think about. I'm based in Shetland, work for UHI Shetland, and since 2013, I've been working with researchers in the University of the Arctic Network, Arctic Sustainable Art and Design, and we've done a lot about issues you bring up. And I also like to say I prefer to think of places that are geographically remote rather than remote, and we see ourselves at the center of where we are, and the edge is relative. And we have a comment from Anthony Specke, who says, as a university academic and lecturer, as well as a secondary school teacher, I applaud your starting point that pedagogy extends beyond classroom technique to problematize and investigate underlying assumptions in language. But my secondary school teaching self reminds me that pedagogy does still include classroom technique, and indeed that somehow whatever insights emerge from the conceptual investigations must translate into technique, or at least teacher attitude, to make a difference in the classroom. What does Arctic pedagogy mean in that sense, technically or professionally? Well, yeah, it's a question in the end, so we'll let Paul answer, and then Gri will go to you. Okay, sorry about that.
No, I think those are both really welcome comments. So the person who commented from Shetland, please get in touch, because we would love to have you as part of this project. You know, you're more than welcome to join us. I should have said that at the beginning. This is in no way a closed group. You know, anybody can get involved with this, and they can get involved as much or as little as they want. It really is that way. None of us see this as being a project that we own, and you know, we've put a boundary around it. Obviously, we've put boundaries around things to get funding, as one always does, but we are open to work with as many people as possible. Yeah, I mean, I agree. The point made about pedagogy, I think the problem with pedagogy, and I must confess I'm rather encumbered by this. I moved to Scotland 10 years ago, so I've missed a lot of the nonsense that's going on down south now with regard to pedagogy, but I was there for some of it as it came through. And certainly, if one looks at the work that goes on in England and elsewhere, pedagogy is a very, very simple term, and far too simple in my view. But you're right, it does connect to what we do in the classroom. But I think the point of pedagogy that we're looking at is we need to look at this as asking questions. For example, you know, what do we learn? Why do we learn this? You know, what's important to learn? And often those questions are asked from a curriculum tradition. And that's all well and good. And Scotland has a rich tradition of curriculum, but not a rich tradition of pedagogy. Other countries have a more rich tradition of pedagogy and less of a tradition of curriculum. And that's, you can go into the history of that at another time. So yeah, it is important that we have those. It is important that translates into the classroom, but I think really for us that translation needs to be undertaken by people in the classroom with support and help with support from others who've maybe engaged in this sort of work, but not in a way of, okay, so what do you now do? But okay, so if these are the principles, you know, how does that look if we think about being in and acting on the world with and for others, rather than just how do I get my notes into your notes by going through the mind of both, or not going through the mind of both, as it were. So it's trying to stretch that a little bit more, but then we will have to come back obviously to those classroom processes, like didactics. I guess you could talk about it. Yeah.
Thanks, Paul. Gry?
Hey, thank you. Do you hear me? Yes, good. Thank you, Paul, and thank you, John, and also thank you for the comments in the chat. I find this really promising and also very interesting. I was going to comment on this center-periphery relationship, but I would also like to address my comment to the last question in the chat, because as Paul said, was that we are moving from methods of teaching to a more phenomenological aspect of teaching, as I understand. And I think that is not at all excluding what is happening in the classroom. On the contrary, it is really trying to contextualize the learning that is going on in the classroom, and also to make a connection to the learning, lifelong learning outside the classroom also. So that is important. But what we are doing, we are working on this, and we are trying to understand how to approach this. I have been collaborating with my Danish colleagues. And as some of you know, I come from a region, the northernmost region in Norway, and the region has the same size as Denmark, but there are much more sparsely populated in that area. It's only 78,000 people living there. And now I work at the Arctic University of Norway in Tromsø. But what I find very interesting is to see that my Danish colleagues, when we are writing articles together, they have their empirical material from Denmark, and I have mine from the northern part of Norway. And the center periphery meaning and dimensions is almost the same when it comes to what kind of meaning that is connected to the center and the periphery. And we know that center and periphery are relational aspects. It is not defined as fixed as once and for all. But what is interesting is that the periphery is very often, it is the other of the rural, it is the other of the center, it is the other of the modern world. And that, John, gives the possibility to have both romanticizing descriptions of such areas, and also as the opposite to the modern world, it is also more backwards in a way. So it has both positive and also negative connotations. And I have written one article many years ago about the internal othering, and I wrote it with a Danish and a Swedish colleague. And we were, the Danish colleague, she was describing the rotten banana, and perhaps some of you in Denmark knows about that, where that is. And the Swedish colleague, she was describing the northern part of Sweden, and I was describing the northern part of Norway. And if you are interested, I have some publications that I could share with you. But I find it very interesting to see how we can describe and to approach this rural, what we can call peripheries, in both pedagogics and also within other disciplines. And what you said, John, about your PhD students, it seems very promising and also very interesting. So I hope we can get in touch with her. Thank you.
Just that.
Thanks, great. Paul, do you want to respond to anything or comment?
No, I shall just, okay. I will lower my hand.
Okay, good. No, I mean, I think Greece summed it up. Actually, summed it up better than I did, actually. Yes. No, nothing to add.
Thanks, Paul. If anyone else wants to ask a question, now is the time. And while people are thinking, I'm going to ask a very selfish question of you because, you know, I'm not going to go into pretending I understand all of the, you know, methodological issues that you do as a, you know, as a teacher, as well as a scholar. I always think like, what can I do better when, you know, I go to give lectures somewhere in the Arctic or somewhere in rural areas of Scotland. I mean, I'm in Aberdeen, and we often talk about ourselves as being on the periphery. So I guess my question to you, you know, as a lecturer and as a teacher, are there any practical recommendations you can give to teachers who, you know, travel to Arctic areas from, you know, the West? What can we do better, in practical terms, from your research?
I mean, our future work hopes to answer more of those questions, I think. But I think for me, so this is a personal view. I think there are two questions to ask yourself. Is one, you know, where am I going? And I don't just mean put it into Google Maps and okay, so it's going to take me an hour and a half to drive there, and that's. I mean, really, where am I going? You know, and why am I going there? You know, what is it I hope to do when I'm there? You know, where am I going and why? You know, all too often, I mean, I'm guilty of this myself, absolutely guilty of this myself. You know, we tip up to a meeting somewhere else and we bring our baggage with us, and we present in a way which is, you know, particularly oriented towards either an imagined audience or an audience we've been told about, or indeed an audience we might not have been told about. And those sorts of questions, I think, often aren't asked. And the where are we going just seem, as I say, it's just seemingly, oh right, okay, so I've got to get the number 12 bus, and then I've got to get on this, and I've got to get that. And there's no question about what it means to be in that area. You know, what does that actually mean for the people who are there, and what does it mean for me to visit that? You know, because when I'm visiting somewhere, it's not just me going physically; it's me going emotionally, and there's a connection with past, present, and future all at the same time. So I might be here chronologically at the moment, but I bring my past with me and my future thoughts and my future intents with me. That's why I go somewhere and why I do something. And asking those questions, I think, is a good way to start. I don't think it solves all of your problems, if indeed there are any problems. I don't think it solves those challenges. But what it does do, I think, is make you more aware of the why and the how, you know, the purposes of why we're doing these things. Yeah, I think that's what I'd say at the moment. But hopefully we might have more answers for you after this next round of after this next project, which is a 2-year project. So we'll wait and see.
Well, thanks. I mean, that's helpful. You know, it's simple things, but I think they need to be asked and answered, because often, like that, I caught myself a few times thinking like, why am I even going? I'm not sure. Is it just because I'm in a different institution, you know, that's considered to be, you know, expert in a particular thing? But I'm sure there are people locally who could probably address this, you know, in a way that's much more suitable. Anyway, we have a comment or a question from John, and then Kalpana.
Thanks, Paul and Gry. Actually, I grew up in the rotten banana. but I know those. Yeah. Anyway, I think what you say, Gry, about the need for a phenomenological perspective in order to investigate these things are very, very important. I know that Greta, and I will pass on the invitation. I think she'll be very happy for it, because it's, for many students, it's a little of a lonely field.
Yeah.
Metropolis.
Yes, it is. Yes.
But she's kind of coined or taken from the Faroe Islands this concept of Reika, which apparently, if I've understood her correctly, means this things that you don't need to say everything with words. Reika is a way of letting things go, of giving time its time, and of not interfering with children. She's working with preschool. Not interfering with children all the time, but kind of letting things develop and kind of being there as a resource somehow. And it's in that connection that she's interested in what she's looking upon, like the brutalizing concepts of well-being and evidence and so on and so forth. This idea that well-being is something you can frame into a template with a lot of questions from 1 to 5, and then you can kind of reduce them to numbers, and then you can compare countries and things like that. And that seems like a very brutal way, actually, of disregarding what is happening and what is particular in Faroese pedagogy, which is very often implicit, as I've understood her.
Yeah, John. I mean, this new numerification is really problematic. Really problematic. I mean, and you're right, and that's a beautiful example you use of well-being. You know, well-being has now become an industry. It's now become an economic industry. It's now become something that you can do your well-being check. You know, so today I'm at 1, or I should be at 5, or I'm at 3, or should be at 4, or whatever. And you can have all of that, and that economic model, that industry of well-being it is really problematic, because it operates often from a metrocentric position. It operates from a real stagist approach to children and young people's development, indeed adult development. You know, if we think about the work of, the name's gone out of my head now, but some talking about emotional development throughout the lifespan, and this very simplistic view that you go through these particular stages. I mean, I can't remember the name of the author, but I get they would challenge that simplistic view, but often those are taken forward. And when we think about teaching, for example, you know, if we teach P1, we do certain things in P1, and then we do certain things in P2, and we do certain things in P3. So, you know, we get a whole bunch of kids, and we put them together when they're age 5 and 6, and we put them together when they're age 7 and 8 and 6 and 7 or whatever. And we kind of take them through these particular things, and they're expected to learn A, B, and C by the time they get to this age, and they're expected to be able to do that. And then, of course, what happens is, or those children that live up in Crian Larich, for example, or those children that live right up in Peterhead or out in the wild somewhere, or they're missing out, aren't they? Because they don't have these opportunities. Now, I grew up in a very rural environment, and I can tell you now, I didn't miss out on anything. In fact, I think I had a much more wonderful and colourful child. It was certainly colourful childhood than most people who lived in urban environments. So I thoroughly reject this kind of metrocentricity in that sense. But, you know, I think there is a challenge for us all the time to be thinking about, as I said before to you, Daria, you know, why are we doing what we're doing? Why are we here? You know, what is it we're actually wanting to do when we're here, or we're needing to do? But then the question is, you know, what do other people need, and what other people's points of view? And that phenomenological view is deeply important, because it challenges a simplistic chronological view of development, and understands and makes us realize that, you know, we are living in the past, present, and future at the same time, at the same moment. And actually, if we carry that with us, it moves us forward, I think, in ways that are, you know, not bound by this context here now, but opens up the world in a variety of different ways, and in a variety of different forms. I think Kalpana was next. Was she, Daria? Is that right?
Yes, thank you. Thank you for the final question or comment today, Kalpana.
Hi, Kalpana.
Hi, everyone, and thank you so much, Paul.
Lovely to see you
the
again.
other participants. I was kind of contemplating, if you will, musing on the role of the teacher, because we talk of pedagogy. I guess having taught since 1986, if there's one thing I have learned, now I was comfortable in my own zone teaching in India, and then I come to the Faroes in 1991 and began teaching in 1992, is because the Faroe society is so small. relationships are spaghetti-like in their connections. I have always focused on creating this idea when I speak to my pre-service teachers of the sense of belonging, of giving the student the agency to actually listen to the student voice, very easily overlooked the Faroese context because of the size of society, because of so many things that are implicit when you're a member of a microcosmic and micro society. But I think ultimately what I emphasize to my pre-service teachers is the fact that the Faroes, whether we like it or not, has become multi-ethnic, multicultural, multilingual. So could they, in their relationship with students, focus on who they are and what is the culture that they drag into the classroom as the norm, and look at the diverse students using those spectacles. I ask that they be sensitive, that they appreciate that to learn, students need to feel they belong, regardless of whether they're ethnic Faroese or otherwise. So teacher competences or teaching competences all boil down to human interaction. So I think as a teacher in a position of power, we need that understanding of ourselves and of the students we meet, and meet them with a respect and a humility, I think, that would bridge many barriers. And then, of course, comes the subject competence and so on and so forth. Yeah, pedagogical competence, pedagogical knowledge, and all of that we are all aware of. Thank you.
Yeah. I have nothing to say other than exactly. Yes, it's beautifully put, Kalpana, beautifully put. Yeah, I absolutely agree with you. Yeah, I absolutely agree. Yeah, and that is what we are. That is what we are trying to do. I mean, quite where we end up is actually the wonder of the journey. I think really, you know, none of us are quite sure where this will lead. We all have ideas, but we're not quite sure. But actually, that's the beauty of this. That's the wonder of this, is that we are getting together and we're you know, sharing ideas, thrashing around thoughts, and coming out with things that hopefully can support people at a variety of levels, I suppose you could say, you know, in whatever context. But thank you, Kalpana. That was beautifully put. Thank you.
Thank you both. I think that's a very important point to finalize our webinar today, Ed. And I'd like to thank all those who asked questions and made comments, and to thank again Paul for your contribution and for starting this off, and to thank Jill for facilitating this organization. We have further seminars lined up across different disciplines, so please do check it out. And if you would like to have your own research promoted on the ScAN website, we're always very open for collaboration. So thank you all very much, and I hope you have the good rest of the day.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.